Hey guys, welcome back. We have some interesting data out here. These are the updated quarterly approval and disapproval numbers of all 100 U.S. senators. I'm not going to go through all 100 senators individually because that would take a long period of time. So what I'm going to do is just focus more so on the interesting data. Now, these numbers, as you would expect, if you're a Democrat representing a very blue-leaning state, that's likely to boost your numbers up, and the same can be said about Republicans. If you're representing a very red state and you're a Republican, that's likely to help you out at the end of the day. And if you're in those more battleground scenarios, or maybe even a Democrat representing a red state or a Republican representing a blue state, that's likely to hurt your numbers at the end of the day. So there's 34 Senate seats up for bids going into 2020. 13 of these are expected to be within the realm of competitive battleground territory, and of those 13 competitive Senate seats, 3 of them are currently held by Democrats, and 10 of them are currently held by Republicans. And it's a much more favorable map for the Democrats this time around going into 2020 than that brutally tough map that they had in the midterms going into 2018. And because of this, the Democrats are at least within the realm of possibility that they could get to the majority or the 50 Senate seats that they would need if they were to go on and win the presidency as well in 2020. Because if the Democrats want to get anything done, if they do win the presidency, they basically have to get the majority in the Senate, or at least that 50-seat number. The tiebreaker obviously going to the vice president. In that scenario, it would be the Democrats. But also important for the Republicans, where if they want to block the legislation that the Democrats want to push through, then they need to hold on to a lot of these competitive seats. We'll see how it all plays out. Should be a fascinating scenario and likely very close to that 50-50 number at the end of the day. So starting off here, the highest approval senators are actually the 2 only independent senators, those being Angus King of Maine as well as Bernie Sanders from Vermont, and Bernie Sanders having the highest overall approval from his home state of all of the 2020 Democratic hopefuls. Going down, Amy Klobuchar also doing very well for herself. She's running for the nomination for the Democrats in 2020 for the presidency, and she has 56% approval compared to 30% disapproval, which is actually very strong for a Midwestern state. Minnesota does lean towards the Democrats, but Amy Klobuchar, she did extremely well in her re-election bid. Very positive numbers for her, but those positive numbers that she's had in the state of Minnesota hasn't really translated all that well to her having success for her presidential bid, where she has been hovering in the very low single digits, usually around 1 or 2 percentage points. All right, so Shaheen, this is a Democratic-held Senate seat that's at least listed in the realm of likely to be competitive. Now, these are very good numbers for Shaheen, plus 20 points to the net positive approval, which is looking really strong for her re-election bid going to 2020. All right, continuing to go down the list here. Let's see if we can see some more interesting numbers. All right, so Steve Daines, the Republican from Montana, 50% approval, 29% disapproval. Relatively good numbers for him. I think that the only chance the Democrats might have of winning Montana is if Bullock, the Democratic governor, runs. He's currently running for the 2020 presidential nomination. No chance that he is going to be able to win that one. He wasn't even on the debate stage for the first round of debates. Not sure if he's going to run for this Senate bid if he doesn't, or if things don't work out for him with his presidential bid, but I think that that would be the Democrats' best case scenario. But Steve Daines not doing terrible in terms of his overall approval numbers, actually quite good in comparison to the other senator from Montana, Jon Tester, who isn't doing nearly as well in terms of his overall approval numbers. Because this is a Republican-leaning state, it can be competitive. They've shown that Democrats can win statewide, especially in this region of the country where you have extremely Republican-leaning states like Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota. Montana can at least be a bit more competitive than some of these other states in the region, and it will be worth looking at going into 2020. All right, so we have Elizabeth Warren. I'm actually surprised that she doesn't do a bit better. The Democrat from Massachusetts, only 8 percentage points to the positive approval, 49% approval, 41% disapproval in the state of Massachusetts. And her re-election bid in 2018 wasn't quite as strong as probably many were expecting. For whatever reason, Warren just isn't resonating quite as well with her constituents in the state of Massachusetts, because we take a look at the other senator from Massachusetts, very progressive Senator Ed Markey, 53% approved compared to 23% disapprove. Much stronger numbers. For whatever reason, Elizabeth Warren just not doing quite as well in her state of Massachusetts that she is representing. All right, continuing to go down here and take a look at some more competitive races. So we have the Republican from Georgia, David Perdue. His numbers aren't too bad either. 48% approval, 26% disapproval. Georgia is a state in that southeastern region of the country where you can get more competitive statewide results in contrast to the states around it like South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, for instance. It's actually kind of trending more towards being a state like Florida, which is obviously one state south of Georgia. And you might be asking yourself, why is Georgia so much more competitive than its neighboring states of South Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee? And the reason for this, obviously, not just the fact that they have a large African-American population like some of those other southeastern states, but they also have an extremely large metropolitan city hub of the city of Atlanta, obviously, which has been trending towards the Democrats. The Democrats have been picking up those suburban districts that are around the area of Atlanta for the U.S. Congress. And when you have a large population hub and it's trending in a Democratic direction, that's just making things more interesting on the statewide elections. We saw that with the 2018 governorship, extremely close race. Stacey Abrams came up just short. If she decided that she wanted to run for this Senate seat, I think that it would likely be highly competitive, especially in a presidential year. It would be right around a 50-50 scenario. Even though David Perdue, his numbers aren't terrible by any means in terms of his overall approval. Stacey Abrams, a known commodity now, much higher name recognition. That could help her out. Also, just in terms of generating enthusiasm and turnout of the African-American vote could help in the Democrats trying to pick up a Democratic Senate seat in a state like Georgia, which is historically and consistently leaning towards the Republicans. And I want to just apologize in advance. If I happen to miss, I'm just going through this list right now. If I happen to miss one of those competitive Senate seats, I do apologize. But another interesting number here for a 2020 Democratic hopeful, Cory Booker. His numbers probably aren't quite as good as he would want either. They're not terrible by any means, though. 47% approve, 34% disapprove in the Democratic-leaning state there of New Jersey. The Democratic leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, his numbers 47% approve, 35% disapprove. And here's the other side of that Montana situation. The Democrat from Montana who just won his re-election bid in 2018, highly competitive race. Tester was able to eke it out. He has a 47% approve compared to 40% disapprove. So the Republican senator from that state doing much better in terms of the overall approval numbers. And continuing to go down and taking a look at some other interesting numbers. So Kyrsten Sinema was able to flip that Republican Senate seat over to the Democrats in Arizona, and her numbers are actually pretty respectable for a freshman Democratic senator in a state that has generally leaned towards the Republicans. It is kind of trending more towards that battleground scenario, but 46% approve compared to just 30% who disapprove, so pretty solid numbers overall there for Kyrsten Sinema. All right, so Susan Collins, devastating numbers for her. Maine tends to be a bit more Democratic leaning, especially in presidential years. Susan Collins, there's been elections in the past where people thought it would be competitive and she's done very well, but I think her vote for Kavanaugh really going to hurt her this time around. She's actually underwater, just a devastating 48% disapproval compared to 45% who approve, and this is one of the top targets for the Democrats. And this kind of has a feeling like we had in 2018 where some of these Democrats in states like Indiana, Missouri, North Dakota, they were in a situation where they had at least a chance as being incumbents. But at the end of the day, the partisan lean of those states were too much for those incumbents to overcome. That could possibly be the case here with Susan Collins, especially with how she handled that whole Brett Kavanaugh scenario. Obviously not sitting well with a lot of these Maine constituents where she has just a devastatingly high 48% disapproval. And right below her, we have Joe Manchin, who just won a very competitive race in 2018. It's not easy for Democrats to win in the state of West Virginia. Joe Manchin was able to eke out a competitive victory, just barely above water in terms of his approval, 48% approve compared to 42% who disapprove in what has become a very Republican heavy-leaning state. All right, Chuck Grassley, another Republican whose likely not in 2020, but beyond that. I believe his reelection bid is in 2022. Joni Ernst, I believe, is the one that's in 2020. But Chuck Grassley, not great numbers for him, the Republican from Iowa, 44% approved compared to 39% who disapprove. And Camille Harris, obviously running for the 2020 Democratic presidential bid. Her numbers probably aren't quite as good as she would like in her home state of California. Not terrible. She's actually better than what Dianne Feinstein has, the senior senator there from the state. Kamala Harris, 44% approve compared to 31% who disapprove. John Cornyn, another Republican that could be in a competitive situation. A state like Texas is trending more towards being a competitive scenario. Obviously, very consistently Republican state, and that's still the case even to today. Beto O'Rourke showed that at least can be competitive. We saw that in 2018. He came up just short statewide against Ted Cruz. Now, John Cornyn, he doesn't have as many negative feelings towards him as what somebody like a Ted Cruz might have, but he also doesn't have as much name recognition. He's just not as well known as Ted Cruz throughout the state, so his overall approval numbers are also a little bit lower, even though his disapproval numbers aren't quite as high. But the fact that he's not quite as well known maybe means that it opens up the door for the Democrats, especially if Beto O'Rourke decides that he maybe wants to run for the Senate again in the state of Texas. I think that could make things highly competitive. But not terrible numbers either by any means for John Cornyn. You definitely don't want to have a 32% of people who don't have an opinion of you, which means that that opens the door a little bit if you're not quite as well known of a senator. People, if they don't have that name recognition association with you, you might not do quite as well. So we'll see if Beto O'Rourke decides maybe if he wants to run for this Senate bid, if the presidential thing doesn't work out for him, if that could be a competitive race there in Texas, maybe potentially flip over to the Democrats. And it does feel like Texas is a state that within the next decade or so is either going to be right in the middle of being a battleground state or maybe even becoming a bit more Democratic. We'll see how that shapes out in that state who's having a changing demographic and voter base. It continues to be that way in these coming years and election cycles. Dianne Feinstein, she just won her re-election bid. There's actually two Democrats that went against each other. That's how the jungle primaries work there in California, where the top two primary vote getters go to the general election. But De Leon came up short in what was a relatively competitive race. Dianne Feinstein, not great numbers. She is a very, very moderate Democrat, and that's probably why her numbers aren't so great in the much more left-leaning state of California. 36% approve, 43% disapprove. Kyrsten Gillibrand also running for the 2020 Democratic presidential bid. She's at 43% approval, 31% disapproval in the state of New York. Mike Braun, he just was able to flip a seat in 2018, the Republican taking down Donnelly. He's at 42% approved, 27% disapprove, and also a lot of people. This tends to be the case with freshman senators where a lot of people just aren't sure whether they approve or disapprove of you at this early on stage of the process. Now, Joni Ernst, she's going to be in a competitive race. Not great numbers for her. She's at 42% approve, 38% disapprove, depending on who the Democrats put up in this one, especially in a presidential year. For instance, if the Democrats have a strong candidate at the top of the presidential ticket, that can perhaps generate more enthusiasm and turnout. And Iowa is a state that has shown that it can swing massively from one direction to the other. Back in 2008, Obama won it by around 10 or so percentage points. Just this past presidential election cycle in 2016, Trump won it by around 10 or so percentage points. So we can see a massive swing there. We'll see if the Democrats are able to put up somebody that generates the kind of enthusiasm where maybe it's kind of a strong tide that lifts all boats there, a down ticket effect. Maybe that has a positive impact for the Democrats trying to take down the incumbent Joni Ernst and what's likely to be very competitive there in the state of Iowa. All right, we're getting towards the bottom half of this list here. All right, so Martha McSally, going to be a tough re-election bid for her. Actually, she lost her election bid in 2018 to Kyrsten Sinema, and her numbers aren't nearly as good in the state of Arizona as the Democrat Sinema. So we see Mcsalley here, 37% disapprove to 40% to approve, so only a positive 3 percentage points there. The Democratic senator from Arizona who just won her election, I think she was like positive 16 points. We touched on that a little bit earlier in this video, and I think the Democrats have a tremendous chance of flipping this seat. Mark Kelly, the astronaut, is running for the Democratic primary. He's going to be a very strong candidate to potentially go on and win the nomination. And McSally going against Kelly, that would be a really tough race for her to win. You'd probably give a pretty decent lean over to the Democrats in that scenario, especially with McSally not having great numbers in terms of her overall approval. And interesting, the state of Kentucky, very Republican leaning, but they do not like their senators. But Rand Paul, a little bit better, actually quite a bit better than McConnell. We'll get to that lower on in this list. All right, so Rand Paul, 39% disapprove, 40% approve in that one. Jackie Rosen, she just flipped the Senate seat in the state of Nevada from the Republican Heller. So the Democrats now have this one. Her numbers aren't overwhelmingly positive, but also a lot of people who still haven't formed an opinion on her. 40% approve, 33% who disapprove. All right, guys, so I had to readjust the screen a bit because for whatever reason, the bottom results got cut off from the data that I was looking at, but we can see it now going from where I was just leaving off, and that was at Michael Bennet, the Democrat from Colorado, who is running for the presidency. He has absolutely no chance of winning the Democratic nomination, but he was at least able to reach that first debate stage. If you're going to be running for the Democratic nomination, you probably should at least have strong name recognition or just strong overall approval numbers from your home state, but Michael Bennet doesn't really have that. 39% approve, a very large 29% who don't even have an opinion of him, and then 32% who disapprove. And in a Democratic-leaning state like Colorado, not necessarily the best overall numbers there from Michael Bennet. And then we take a look at Doug Jones. I actually think it's a positive for him in a state like Alabama, which is one of the most Republican-leaning states in the country. The fact that a Democratic senator is slightly above water in his approval is probably a victory for him at the end of the day, but still obviously not great numbers. 39% approve compared to 37% who disapprove. And this one, it feels like the writing's on the wall where he was able to win the special election against Roy Moore. Maybe he can go against Roy Moore this time around and win again, but that's probably, in my opinion anyways, his best case scenario and maybe his only chance to keep this Senate seat. But Roy Moore is going to be running again on the Republican side, so there's at least an opportunity and a pathway forward for the Democrats where they can perhaps continue to somehow keep this Senate seat in the state of Alabama. And we're getting right down here towards the bottom of the list. I kind of find this one interesting, actually, where Roy Blunt, the Republican from Missouri, is actually underwater with his approval. 37% approve, 39% disapprove in Missouri, which has been trending more towards becoming a extremely consistent Republican stronghold for whatever reason. I believe, I can't remember exactly when it was or what it was for, but I think there was one time where Blunt actually spoke out against the president, which is actually surprising because Blunt, very conservative guy, strong Republican, but maybe that's the reason why his numbers aren't quite as good. I don't know. For whatever reason, his numbers just aren't as good as I would expect them to be in a state like Missouri. And going down one more spot, we have Cory Gardner, the Republican from Colorado, and he's going to have a really tough re-election bid. Colorado, a Democratic-leaning state, especially in a presidential year, going to be tough for Gardner, and his numbers aren't great, where he's even 37 approve, 37 who disapprove. Pat Roberts, he's actually not running for re-election. He doesn't have great numbers either, and that's going to be the case, obviously, for all the candidates here towards the bottom of this list. Kansas, actually statewide in 2018, went for the Democrats for the governorship, and that was against Chris Kobach, and Kobach, I believe recently he announced that he is going to be running for the on the Republican side in that primary. So if Kobach goes on and wins the primary, that would be a situation where the Democrats also could have an open door and possibly win this Senate seat like they were able to do so for the governorship in 2018, something to keep an eye on. Really a best case scenario for the Democrats to try to pick up as many Senate seats as possible would be if Kobach won on the Republican side in Kansas and Roy Moore won on the Republican side in Alabama. That would be a dream scenario for the Democrats in those two states. And then we also see Mitch McConnell, just devastatingly bad numbers. He has the worst overall net approval numbers, -14, so 36% approve, 50% disapprove. And Kentucky, a very Republican-leaning state, but when you have this bad of numbers, it means if the Democrats can put up somebody that has somewhat of an appeal to the voters, they could possibly win this state. I'm not necessarily sure McGrath is that person. She announced recently that she's running for the Democratic primary, and she actually did really well in her first day of fundraising. But You know, she is one of those candidates who plays to the room where it just doesn't feel like her positions are etched in stone by any means. She kind of more so plays to the crowd that she's speaking to, and that inauthenticity, it used to work in the past, maybe 80s, 90s, but getting to the current state of how things are going, I feel like you have to be very authentic in your positions to have your best chance at going on and winning an election. McGrath, I don't know, perhaps it's a situation where she can do well enough amongst women voters, maybe get a boost from that demographic where that could possibly push her over the line, but we'll see how things play out in the state of Kentucky. If it is McGrath that goes on and wins the nomination, or if it's somebody else, could be a very competitive race, and almost it seems likely to be at least relatively competitive there in the state of Kentucky, given how bad McConnell's overall approval numbers are. And Menendez, for the Democrats that are looking to win Kentucky, just remember that in 2018, the Republicans thought that they could win New Jersey because Menendez had such terrible approval numbers. He actually went on to win rather convincingly. So if you're a Democrat in a very blue-leaning state like New Jersey, or a Republican in a very red-leaning state like Kentucky, even if your approval numbers aren't great, that doesn't mean you're not going to go on and win re-election. So Menendez, 34% approve compared to 42% who disapprove. And then Gary Peters, for whatever reason, his numbers are not very strong. Still above water, 34% on the approval side, 27% disapprove, but an extremely large 40% of people who don't have an opinion one way or the other on Peters in a Democratic-leaning overall state like Michigan. Now, it would still be a surprise at the end of the day if Peters didn't go on and carry this one, especially in a presidential year. And things are looking better for the Democrats in the state of Michigan. They flipped some congressional districts in the 2018 midterms, and also President Trump has very poor net approval ratings in the state of Michigan, a state that he was able to carry by the slimmest of margins back in 2016. Now, the Republicans, not without the realm of possibility that they could go on and mount a challenge to Peters. Now, we saw back in 2018, Debbie Stabenow was able to fend off a challenge from Republican John James. James running again this time around, and perhaps he's able to have more success potentially against Peters than what he had against Stabenow, and he actually did better against Stabenow than I was expecting. Kept that one within single digits. He's going to have a little bit more name recognition this time around, too, that being the Republican John James, if he goes on and wins the primary on the Republican side. Gary Peters also not as well known, or not having quite as good numbers as Debbie Stabenow in the state of Michigan. He's a very moderate Democrat, doing things like voting for increasing military spending, deregulating the banks. He was one of the only Democrats that voted to approve Ajit Pai as the head of the FCC, just to name a few things that he's done in recent years that might not sit all that well with some of the more left-leaning voters in the state of Michigan, but one to keep an eye on. But at the end of the day, it would be a surprise if Peters wasn't able to go on and win that one. And then the Republican Tom Tillis from North Carolina. North Carolina going to be a very competitive battleground state for the presidency in 2020, but also this Senate seat likely to be extremely close. The Democrats have shown that they can win statewide in North Carolina. They won the governorship not all that long ago. And Tillis, his numbers just aren't that impressive. 33% approve, which is the lowest of all 100 senators from his home state, to 35% who disapprove. And that wraps up this list, guys. I appreciate you stopping by and listening to me ramble on about all of these senators and their net approval ratings. If you want more of this content in the future, consider subscribing, and I hope to see you guys back here for my next video.